Hey everyone, welcome back to English Inside Out. Today we're talking about three incredibly common English words. Three words that native speakers use all the time, in podcasts, in interviews, in meetings, in coffee shops, in everyday conversations. And honestly, most English learners understand their basic meanings, but still don't really understand why people use them so much. Today's episode is about actually, basically, and honestly, and I think this is one of those topics that surprises people, because these words seem simple, almost insignificant, like little extra words that don't really matter. But once you start paying attention, you realize they're everywhere.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that learners often focus on vocabulary. They ask things like, what does actually mean? What does basically mean? What does honestly mean? And that's understandable. But honestly, that's usually the wrong question, because the real question is, why did the speaker choose that word? And that's where things become fascinating.
Exactly. Because native speakers often use these words even when they don't add any new information. Think about that for a second. Imagine someone says, actually, I like it, or basically, we finished the project, or honestly, I don't know. If you remove those words, the information stays almost exactly the same. So why are they there? Why do native speakers keep using them?
Let's imagine you're listening to a podcast, maybe an interview with an actor. Or a business podcast, or a YouTube conversation, and suddenly you notice something strange. The speaker says, actually. Then, a few minutes later, basically, then later, honestly. And after a while you're thinking, why do they keep saying these words? Are they necessary? Are they filler words? Are they habits? Are they just random?
And honestly, this is where many learners start feeling confused. Because technically, they understand every word, but they still feel like they're missing something, like there's a hidden layer underneath the conversation. And the truth is, there is.
Because most learners think these words are about meaning, but most of the time, they're actually about communication management. They're not just carrying information, they're shaping the conversation. They're helping speakers organize thoughts, adjust expectations, express emotions, soften opinions, guide attention, and native speakers do this constantly, usually without even realizing it.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the biggest differences between textbook English and real English. Textbooks often teach vocabulary meaning, but real conversations depend heavily on conversational intention. Why are you saying this? What feeling are you creating? What reaction are you preparing people for? That's where these words become incredibly important. Actually, I think there's a really good way to visualize this. Imagine a conversation is like driving a car.
Okay, I wasn't expecting that. Go on.
The main sentence is the car itself. That's the information. But words like, actually, basically, honestly, are more like the steering wheel. They're not the destination. They're not the engine, but they help guide the direction. They tell people how to interpret what comes next.
Yeah, I like that, because these words often prepare the listener emotionally, almost like little signals. For example, when someone says, honestly, your brain immediately pays attention. You start thinking, okay, this person is about to tell me what they really think.
Exactly. Or when someone says, basically, your brain expects a summary, a simplified version, a big picture explanation, and all of that happens automatically. Most native speakers aren't consciously thinking about it.
And that's really the central idea of today's episode. Because this episode is not about dictionary definitions. It's about conversational psychology. It's about understanding why these words appear so often in natural English, and why fluent speakers rely on them constantly.
We're going to explore how actually gently changes expectations, how basically simplifies complexity, how honestly creates emotional transparency, why native speakers use these words everywhere, and how these tiny expressions completely change the feeling of a conversation.
And by the end of this episode, you won't just understand these words.
You'll start noticing them everywhere. In podcasts, in interviews, in movies, in meetings, and once you notice them, you'll start understanding conversations at a completely different level.
Alright, so let's start with the first one. And honestly, this might be one of the most misunderstood words in spoken English.
Because most people think it means one thing, but native speakers are usually doing something much more interesting with it. Let's talk about actually.
Alright, so let's start with the first word. And honestly, This might be one of the most misunderstood words in spoken English.
Yeah, because most learners think they already understand it. They learn that, actually, na verdade, and then they move on. Problem solved. Or at least, they think it's solved.
Exactly, but then they start listening to real English. Podcasts, TV shows, conversations, and suddenly native speakers are saying, actually, all the time. And not always in situations where na verdade seems to make sense.
Yeah. Sometimes someone says, actually, I think that's a great idea. Or, actually, I was there last year. Or, actually, I don't mind. And learners start wondering, why is that word there? Because technically, the sentence works perfectly without it.
Exactly, and that's the first big insight. Most of the time, actually is not adding information. It's managing expectations. It's helping the speaker gently adjust what the other person is thinking. And that's a completely different way to think about the word.
I love that. Because if you pay attention, actually often appears when reality is slightly different from what someone expects. Not dramatically different, just slightly. And native speakers use actually to guide people toward that new reality.
Let's imagine a simple situation. You're talking to a friend. Your friend says, "So, you don't really like sushi, right?" And you answer, "Actually, I love sushi." Now, what's happening there? You're not attacking your friend. You're not saying, "You're wrong." You're simply adjusting the picture in their head.
Exactly. And that's why actually often sounds surprisingly polite. Because compare these two responses. Someone says, "You don't like sushi," and you answer, "No, you're wrong." Oof. That feels hard immediately.
Yeah, even if it's true, even if the person is completely wrong, the energy suddenly becomes confrontational.
Now compare. Actually, I love sushi. Same correction, same reality, same information, but completely different atmosphere.
And honestly, this happens constantly in English. Native speakers are correcting each other all the time, but they're often doing it very gently, because conversations usually work better when people don't feel attacked.
Exactly. And actually acts almost like a cushion. It softens the correction. It says, "Hey, small adjustment." Not, "You're completely wrong."
Let's imagine another situation. You're at work, a coworker says, "So the meeting starts at 3, right?" And you answer, "Actually, it starts at 2:30. Notice how natural that sounds. Nobody feels criticized. Nobody feels embarrassed. The conversation simply moves forward.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that learners often think fluency comes from using bigger vocabulary. But native speakers often sound natural because they manage tiny moments like this well. Little corrections, little adjustments, little changes in expectations, and actually helps them do that beautifully.
I think there's another reason this word appears so much. Because life is full of assumptions. People assume things constantly. They assume where you're from, what you like, what you think, what happened, what you meant. And every time reality doesn't perfectly match the assumption, actually becomes useful.
That's so true. Imagine someone says, "You must be excited." And you respond, "Actually, I'm a little nervous." Or, "Actually, I'm not sure yet." Or, "Actually, I hadn't thought about it." Again, you're gently redirecting the conversation.
And notice something important. The emotional tone stays calm. That's one reason native speakers love this word. It helps them disagree without creating friction.
Actually, that's a really important point, because many learners think disagreement must sound strong, but natural English often prefers soft disagreement.
Exactly, let's compare two versions. Imagine someone says, "This movie was terrible." Version 1, "No, it wasn't." Version 2, "Actually, I kind of liked it." The second version feels much smoother, much more conversational, much easier for the other person to receive.
Yeah, the first version creates opposition, the second version creates discussion. And those are very different things.
Let's imagine a meeting. Someone presents an idea, and another person says, "Actually, there might be another option." That sounds collaborative, open, professional, now. Imagine they say, "No, that's wrong." Very different energy.
And this is where language becomes social psychology, because the words themselves aren't the whole story. The emotional effect matters too. and advanced speakers are constantly managing emotional effect, even if they don't realize it.
Honestly, I think that's one of the biggest differences between textbook English and real English. Textbooks teach meaning. Real conversations teach relationships, and actually lives right at that intersection.
Yeah, because most of the time, actually isn't saying, here's new information. It's saying, let's gently adjust the conversation. And that's a much deeper function.
So, if we simplify everything we've explored so far, actually often appears when reality is slightly different from expectation. It's a tool for correction, but a very soft correction, a very human correction.
Exactly. It's not, you're wrong. It's, there's a small detail you might not know. And honestly, that's why native speakers use it so much.
Alright, so now that we understand how actually helps people adjust reality, let's move to another word that's everywhere in spoken English.
Because this next one does something completely different. It doesn't correct reality. It simplifies reality. And once you notice it, you'll hear it absolutely everywhere. Basically. All right, so now let's move into our second word. And honestly, this one might be even more common than actually.
Yeah, because native speakers use it everywhere at work, with friends, in interviews, on podcasts, in meetings. And after you notice it, you can't stop hearing it.
The word is basically. And what's funny is that learners often translate it as basicamente, which is technically correct. But honestly, that translation doesn't really explain what's happening.
Not at all, because native speakers are rarely thinking, I'm about to say something basic that's not the real function. Most of the time they're thinking, I'm about to simplify something, and that's a huge difference.
Exactly. Actually, I think basically is one of the easiest ways to understand how spoken English works. Because conversations are messy. People don't think in perfect sentences. They don't organize ideas perfectly. They often start talking before they've fully figured out what they want to say. And basically helps organize all that.
That's such a good point, because learners sometimes imagine that fluent speakers always know exactly what they're going to say. But real conversations don't work like that. People are constantly organizing thoughts in real time, and words like basically help them do that.
Let's imagine a simple situation. Your friend asks, so, what happened at work today? Now, technically, you could explain every detail, every conversation, every email, every meeting, every problem. But nobody wants that.
Exactly, most people want the short version, the big picture, the summary, and that's where it basically becomes incredibly useful.
So instead of saying 20 different things, you say, basically, the client changed everything at the last minute. And immediately everyone understands the situation.
Yeah, and notice what happened. You didn't tell the entire story. You gave the essence of the story, the headline, the main idea.
And native speakers do this constantly. Someone asks, how was the trip? Basically, we spent the whole week at the beach. What happened during the meeting? Basically, we decided to postpone the project. How's the new job? Basically, I'm still learning everything.
And what's fascinating is that basically often helps the listener relax because it signals don't worry. I'm going to simplify this.
Exactly. It's almost like saying I'm doing the organizing for you, which makes conversations easier to follow.
Let's imagine a workplace situation. You're presenting a complicated project. There are budgets, deadlines, departments, clients, technical issues, lots of moving parts. Now imagine you say, basically, our goal is to reduce costs while improving customer experience. Suddenly, everyone understands the central idea.
Yeah. And honestly, good communicators do this all the time. They know when people need details, and they know when people need simplicity. Basically, helps create that simplicity.
I think there's another interesting layer here, because sometimes basically isn't just simplifying information, it's buying time.
Oh, absolutely. Native speakers do that all the time.
Let's imagine someone asks you a difficult question. Your brain is still processing. You're still organizing your answer. And you start with, basically, now you have a second to think, a second to organize, a second to decide where you're going.
Yeah. And listeners don't even notice. Because it sounds completely natural. It doesn't feel like hesitation. It feels like communication.
That's one reason these little words are so powerful. They're helping the speaker, but they're also helping the listener at the same time.
Actually, that's something many learners don't realize. Fluency isn't just producing language, it's managing language, organizing it, guiding it, shaping it, and basically is one of those tools.
Let's compare two versions. Imagine someone asks, "What happened?" Version 1. Well, there were several meetings, and then the client sent an email, and then marketing had concerns, and then your listener is already getting lost.
Exactly. Now version 2. Basically, the client changed the plan. Much easier, much clearer, much more conversational.
And that's why you'll hear this word constantly in interviews. Athletes use it, actors use it, CEOs use it, podcasters use it. Everyone uses it because everyone needs to simplify complexity.
Let's imagine a job interview. The interviewer asks, "So tell me about your previous role." A lot of learners immediately start describing every responsibility they've ever had.
Yeah. And after 30 seconds, everybody is confused.
Exactly. A native speaker might say, "Basically, I managed customer accounts and coordinated projects between different teams." Simple, clear, organized.
And that's the feeling of basically, it's not really about making things basic. It's about making things understandable.
I love that distinction. Because those are very different ideas. One sounds simplistic, the other sounds intelligent, and native speakers are usually aiming for clarity, not simplicity for its own sake.
Honestly, I think that's one reason fluent speakers often sound confident. They're good at finding the core message. They're good at saying, "This is the important part," and basically helps them do that.
Yeah, it creates structure, and structure creates confidence for both the speaker and the listener.
So, if we simplify everything we've explored about basically, it's often a signal that says, here's the main idea, here's the summary, here's what really matters.
Exactly. It helps speakers organize complexity, and it helps listeners understand complexity, which is why native speakers use it constantly.
All right. So now we've explored a word that adjusts reality, and a word that simplifies reality.
And now we're moving into a word that's much more emotional. Because this next one isn't really about information. It's about honesty. It's about vulnerability. It's about showing people what you genuinely think.
Let's talk about honestly. All right, so now let's move into our third word. And honestly, this one feels different from the other two.
Yeah, because when someone says, "Actually," they're usually adjusting expectations. When someone says, "Basically," they're usually simplifying information. But when someone says, "Honestly," something else happens. The conversation suddenly becomes more personal, more emotional, more human.
Exactly. And I think that's why this word is so interesting, because technically, it doesn't add information either. Imagine someone says, "I don't know." Now imagine they say, "Honestly, I don't know." The information is identical, but the feeling is completely different.
Yeah, the second version feels more sincere, more open, almost like the person is inviting you into their real thoughts.
And that's what native speakers are often doing. They're signaling something. They're saying, "Okay, I'm going to be genuine right now. I'm going to tell you what I actually think. I'm going to stop filtering this."
Exactly. And that's why you'll hear "honestly" constantly in emotional conversations. Because people use it when they want to create trust.
Let's imagine a simple situation. A friend asks, "So, what did you think of the movie?" You could say, "It was okay. That's fine." Now imagine, "Honestly, I didn't really like it." That feels different.
Much different. Because now it sounds like you're sharing a real opinion, not just giving an answer. You're revealing something personal.
And that's an important distinction. Information and opinion are not the same thing, and honestly often appears right before genuine opinion.
Let's imagine another situation. Someone asks, "Are you excited about the new project?" You pause for a second and say, "Honestly, I'm a little nervous." That feels incredibly natural.
Yeah, because life isn't always simple. Sometimes the truthful answer is more complicated than people expect, and honestly prepares them for that.
I love that. Because honestly often works like an emotional warning sign. Not a negative warning, just a signal. A signal that says, what comes next is how I genuinely feel.
Exactly, and listeners respond differently when they hear that signal. They pay more attention, they become more engaged, because honesty creates interest.
Let's imagine a workplace conversation. Your manager asks, "Do you think this strategy will work?" Now compare these two answers. "I don't think so," and "Honestly, I don't think so." The second version feels more thoughtful, more sincere, more considered.
Yeah, and that's one reason professionals use this word a lot. Not because they're trying to sound dramatic, because they're trying to sound authentic.
Actually, that's something learners often misunderstand. They think professional English is cold, but a lot of professional communication depends on trust, and trust depends on authenticity.
Exactly. People want to know what you genuinely think, especially when decisions matter. And honestly, often signals that you're about to give a real answer, not a diplomatic answer, not a safe answer, a real answer.
Let's imagine a relationship. Someone says, "Are you happy?" Now compare, "I think so," versus, "Honestly, I'm not sure." The second answer feels vulnerable, and vulnerability often creates connection.
Yeah, because honesty makes conversations deeper. The moment people stop performing, real communication begins. And native speakers often use honestly to mark that transition.
I think that's why this word appears so often in podcasts, especially long-form conversations, because people are constantly sharing opinions, experiences, feelings, personal stories, and honestly helps frame those moments.
That's true. Listen to almost any interview. At some point, you'll hear something like, "Honestly, that was one of the hardest moments of my life." Or, "Honestly, I wasn't expecting that." Or, "Honestly, I had no idea what I was doing." And immediately the conversation feels more natural.
Yeah, because perfect people are boring, honest people are interesting, and honestly often opens the door to that honesty.
Let's compare another example. Someone asks, "Do you enjoy your job?" Answer 1, "It's okay." Answer 2, "Honestly, I love it." Or, "Honestly, I'm thinking about leaving." Those answers feel alive because they're emotionally real.
And that's something very important. Honestly doesn't automatically make a sentence positive or negative. It simply makes it personal. That's the key.
Exactly, it can introduce excitement, fear, frustration, joy, uncertainty, the emotion changes, the function stays the same.
And the function is transparency, letting people see what's actually happening inside your head.
So, if we simplify everything we've explored about, honestly, it's often a signal that says, "This is what I genuinely think, this is how I genuinely feel, this is my real perspective."
Exactly. And that's why native speakers use it so much. Because conversations aren't just about facts, they're also about sincerity. And honestly, helps create that sincerity.
Alright? So now we've explored all three words individually.
We've explored how actually adjusts reality, basically simplifies reality, and honestly reveals reality.
But now comes the really interesting part. Because in real conversations, native speakers are constantly choosing between these words. And that's where everything starts connecting.
Because the same sentence can feel completely different depending on which one you choose. And once you start noticing those differences, your understanding of natural English changes dramatically.
So let's put them side by side and see how they completely transform the feeling of a conversation.
All right, so now let's bring everything together. Because this is where learners usually stop memorizing words and start feeling the language.
Yeah, because real fluency isn't knowing definitions. It's understanding effects. It's understanding what happens when a speaker chooses one word instead of another, and honestly, that's where these three words become really interesting.
Let's start with something simple. Imagine someone asks you a question, and you answer, "I don't know." Simple, neutral, direct. Nothing wrong with it.
Now, let's change it slightly. Actually, I don't know. Interesting now. The sentence feels different because it sounds like someone expected you to know. Or maybe you expected yourself to know, and now you're correcting that expectation.
Exactly. It's almost like saying, the reality is a little different from what we thought. That's the feeling.
Now let's try another version. Basically, I don't know. That sounds completely different. Now it feels like there may be a longer explanation, but you're simplifying it. You're saying, If I reduce everything to its simplest form, the answer is that I don't know.
Yeah, and honestly, that version feels surprisingly conversational. You hear native speakers do this all the time.
Now let's look at the third version. Honestly, I don't know. Now the focus shifts completely. The focus is no longer on information, it's on sincerity. The speaker is emphasizing that this is their genuine answer.
Exactly. Same sentence. Three completely different emotional experiences. That's what's fascinating.
Let's try another example. Imagine you're discussing an idea in a meeting. You say, I think this might be a mistake. Okay, now let's change it. Actually, I think this might be a mistake. What happens?
Now it sounds like you're gently challenging something. Maybe the group is moving in one direction, and you're introducing a different perspective.
Exactly, you're adjusting the conversation, not attacking it. Adjusting it.
Now let's try. Basically, I think this might be a mistake. Now it sounds like you've analyzed a lot of details, and you're giving people the simplified conclusion.
Yeah, almost like saying, after everything I've seen, here's the main takeaway.
Now the last version. Honestly, I think this might be a mistake. That feels much more personal, much more emotional, almost like you're revealing your genuine concern.
Exactly, the sentence suddenly feels more human, more vulnerable, more authentic.
Let's imagine another situation. A friend asks, "How was your vacation?" You answer, "It was good. Fine. Nothing unusual." Now imagine, "Actually, it was better than I expected." Now you're correcting an expectation.
Exactly, maybe you thought it would be average, maybe your friend thought it would be average. Either way, the reality was different.
Now compare. Basically, it was exactly what I needed. That feels like a summary, like you're reducing an entire vacation to one central idea.
And now, honestly, it was one of the best weeks I've had in years. That feels emotional, personal, real.
It's amazing how much atmosphere changes with a single word.
And that's why native speakers use these words so much. Not because they're necessary, but because they're useful. They shape how information arrives.
Actually, I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings learners have. They often assume language is about information, but conversation is about much more than information.
Exactly. Conversation is also about tone.emotion, expectation.connection.perspective. And these words help manage all of those things.
Let's imagine a workplace situation. A manager asks, "Do you think we're ready?" Answer 1, "No." Very direct. Now compare. "Actually, I think we still have a few issues." That feels collaborative.
Yeah, now compare. Basically, we still have a few issues. That feels analytical, like you're summarizing a situation.
And then, "Honestly, I don't think we're ready yet." That feels personal, like you're sharing your genuine assessment.
Three different energies, three different intentions, three different social effects.
And that's why understanding these words is so powerful. Because once you understand them, you start hearing conversations differently. You stop focusing only on what people say, and start noticing how they say it.
Honestly, that's a huge step toward real fluency. Because advanced speakers don't just process information, they process intention.
Exactly. And once you start noticing intention, a lot of English suddenly becomes easier to understand.
So if we simplify everything we've explored today,
Actually often adjusts expectations.
basically often simplifies complexity.
And honestly, often reveals genuine feeling.
Different words, different purposes, different emotional effects.
But all three have something in common. They're helping speakers manage conversations, not just deliver information.
And honestly, that's where natural English starts becoming really interesting.
All right. So before we finish, let's bring everything together one final time. Because there's one big lesson hiding underneath everything we've explored today.
Alright, so before we finish, let's zoom out for a second, because honestly, today was never really about three vocabulary words.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most important things to understand. Because if you look at everything we explored today, the real topic wasn't, actually basically honestly, the real topic was communication.
Exactly, because those words are just tools. The bigger lesson is understanding what fluent speakers are doing underneath the words. And honestly, that's where things become really interesting.
Because native speakers are constantly managing conversations, They're managing expectations, clarity, emotion, attention, connection, and they're often doing it with very small words.
Words that learners sometimes ignore because they seem unimportant, they seem optional, like little extra pieces that don't really matter. But then you listen to real English, and they're everywhere.
Exactly. And now you probably understand why. Because these words aren't carrying information, they're carrying intention. That's the hidden layer.
Let's simplify everything one last time. When native speakers say, actually, they're often adjusting expectations. They're gently correcting reality. They're saying, things are a little different than you think.
When native speakers say, basically, they're simplifying complexity. They're helping people find the main idea, the big picture, the essential message.
And when native speakers say, honestly, they're signaling sincerity. They're showing people what's genuinely happening in their minds, what they genuinely feel, what they genuinely believe.
And honestly, once you start noticing these patterns, you hear them everywhere. Movies, TV shows, interviews, podcasts, work meetings, friendships, relationships, everywhere.
And something really interesting starts happening. You stop hearing these words as vocabulary and start hearing them as signals, conversation signals, emotional signals, human signals.
Yeah, and I think that's where learners really level up, because they stop asking, what does this word mean? And start asking, why did this person choose this word? That's a completely different question.
And honestly, it's a much more powerful question, because language isn't just about meaning, it's about intention.
Actually, I think that's one of the biggest differences between intermediate English and advanced English. Intermediate learners understand sentences. Advanced learners understand people.
Wow, I love that, because that's exactly what we're talking about, people. Not grammar charts, not vocabulary lists, people. How they think, how they communicate, how they connect.
And these little words help make that connection smoother. They help conversations feel more natural, more human, more authentic.
So, the next time you're listening to a podcast, or watching a movie, or having a conversation in English, pay attention. Listen for actually, basically, honestly. And instead of asking, what does that word mean? Try asking, what is that word doing?
Because that's where the real lesson is. That's where the real fluency is.
And honestly, once you start hearing those patterns, you can't unhear them. You'll notice them everywhere.
And that's actually a very good thing. Because it means you're starting to hear English the way native speakers use it. Not as a collection of words, but as a system of communication.
And that's where real progress happens. Not when you memorize more vocabulary, but when you start understanding the invisible logic underneath conversations.
All right, before we go, we'd love to hear from you. When you watch movies, listen to podcasts, or talk to native speakers, which one do you hear most often?
Actually, basically, or honestly.
And here's another question. Which one do you almost never use in your own English?
Yeah, write it in the comments. We're curious.
And honestly, that's one of the best ways to improve. Start noticing these words. Start experimenting with them. Start paying attention to the feeling they create.
Because fluency isn't only about saying more. Sometimes it's about understanding the small things that make conversations feel natural.
Exactly. The little words, the hidden signals, the tiny details that native speakers use every single day.
All right, that's it for today.
And if this episode helped you see English a little differently, don't forget to subscribe.
For real English.
Real conversations.
And real progress.
See you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone.